The moment you act on bad information in a survival situation is the moment your odds drop through the floor. Not gradually, not slowly, instantly. Because survival isn't a game of margins. It's a game of compounding decisions, where one wrong assumption in the first hour builds into an irreversible cascade by hour 6. People die a few miles from rescue, carrying the exact advice that failed them. The terrifying part isn't that people die in the wilderness or in disasters or in urban emergencies. The terrifying part is that most of them die doing exactly what they were taught to do. They followed the rule book. They remembered their training. And the training was wrong, not outdated, not misunderstood. Wrong in the exact moments people needed it most. Tonight we're pulling apart 5 of the most deeply embedded survival myths in mainstream emergency culture. We're replacing them with the actual science, and you're going to understand not just what to do differently, but why the myths exist. Because understanding the origin of bad information is the only way you stop yourself from defaulting to it when your hands are shaking and your mind is running on adrenaline. Myth 1. Find water by following animals or birds. Here is the version of events that gets people killed. They're dehydrated, maybe 12 hours into a desert crossing or a backcountry emergency. They remember the rule. Animals know where water is. Follow them downhill, watch the birds at dawn, and they start moving. They cover ground, they burn calories. They accelerate their fluid loss through exertion in high heat, and they find nothing. That single, confident, trained decision has already shortened their survival window by hours. The science here is straightforward. Animals are optimized for their environment across thousands of generations of evolutionary pressure. Their hydration strategies, their water sources, their tolerance for contaminated water, none of it maps onto the human body. Herbivores extract moisture from vegetation that provides humans almost nothing usable. Even grazing mammals can tolerate microbial loads in standing water that would hospitalize a healthy adult within 48 hours. And this is where the myth becomes lethal. The person finds a stagnant seasonal puddle. They drink. And by the time the parasites enter a body already struggling to regulate temperature and fluid balance, they've traded one emergency for 2. The real survival principle isn't about following biology. It's about reading geology. And geology is brutally predictable. Water moves through landscapes according to physics. It follows gravity into depressions, collects in the outside bends of dry riverbeds where subsurface moisture persists, condenses on north-facing rock, faces in environments with significant overnight temperature drops. In arid environments, the rule is read the topography, identify the lowest geological point in your visible terrain, look for the subtle color change in vegetation that signals moisture below ground, and dig before you walk. Moving costs you water, stillness, and strategy preserve it. Rescuers see this pattern constantly. The person who covered the most ground is often in the worst condition. The rule didn't just fail them, it accelerated them toward the outcome they were trying to avoid. Myth 2. In cold water, swim hard for shore. This one kills fit people, strong swimmers, athletes. People in the water thinking clearly, looking at a shoreline that appears reachable. Cold water immersion is one of the most physiologically misunderstood emergencies in survival medicine, and the confusion kills because the instinct feels completely rational. You're cold. You're in danger. The shore is right there. So you swim. What's actually happening inside your body is this. Cold shock, the first phase of immersion response, triggers an involuntary gasp reflex and hyperventilation within the first 30 to 90 seconds of contact with water below 15 degrees Celsius. This is the primary drowning window. Not exhaustion, not distance. Involuntary inhalation while your head is momentarily submerged during that first gasp. But the real danger starts after that. If you survive cold shock, you enter what researchers call swimming failure. In water below 10 degrees Celsius, your hands and arms begin losing coordinated motor control within 3 to 5 minutes as the body pulls blood away from the extremities to protect core temperature. Your body is burning energy it desperately needs to stay warm. And this is where people die, not from the cold directly, but from the gap between how well they think they're swimming and how well they actually are. You cover less distance per unit of effort than you believe. Your stroke mechanics have already broken down. You're spending the last reserves of warmth on forward movement that is no longer efficient. The body is already failing. You just don't feel it yet. The validated protocol, developed through decades of research, including work by Dr. Gordon Giesbrecht at the University of Manitoba, is counterintuitive but clear. If you have a flotation device, float still. If you don't, get horizontal and conserve heat rather than chase distance. The heat escape lessening posture draws the knees to the chest, protects the groin, chest, and major blood vessels where heat escapes fastest, and can extend survival time by up to 50% in cold water. You swim only if the shore is genuinely close, and you haven't yet entered the swimming failure window. Most cold water drowning victims die convinced they were strong enough to make it. The shore was never the variable. The water temperature was. Myth 3. A tourniquet is a last resort that will cost you the limb. Emergency trauma surgeons have been fighting this myth for 20 years. They are still losing. The belief that tourniquet application guarantees amputation is so embedded in civilian emergency culture that people bleed to death from wounds that were survivable. Not because they lacked a tourniquet, but because they were afraid to use one. The origin of the myth is historically real. In earlier conflicts, tourniquets were improvised, applied incorrectly, and left in place for hours without monitoring. Tissue damage was a genuine complication in that specific context. But here is what modern data actually shows. Research analyzing casualty data from Iraq and Afghanistan, published in the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery, found that properly applied commercial tourniquets left in place for under 2 hours showed no statistically significant increase in amputation rates. The Tactical Combat Casualty Care guidelines moved tourniquet application to the top of the hemorrhage control sequence in the late 1990s. Outcomes improved. In civilian settings, the Hartford Consensus, developed after Sandy Hook by trauma surgeons and emergency managers, made the same recommendation for the same reasons. Ephemeral arterial bleed can cause fatal hemorrhagic shock in as little as 3 minutes. 3 minutes. That's the entire window. A tourniquet applied in the first 60 seconds stops that clock. The protocol is straightforward. 2 to 3 inches above the wound, tightened until the bleeding stops completely, time of application noted. Every minute spent hesitating over a myth is a minute the body is spending blood it cannot replace. Today, artery doesn't care what myth you believed. It only cares how long it stayed open. Myth 4. Eat whatever wildlife eats. If animals consume it, it's safe. This myth persists because it sounds logical. It isn't. Different species have fundamentally different metabolic systems, different enzymes, different gut biology, different tolerances built across evolutionary time. The assumption that food safety transfers across species is not a simplification of that biology, it's a reversal of it. Birds process certain berry toxins through pathways humans don't have. Deer regularly browse on yew, one of the most toxic. Plants in the northern hemisphere, without apparent harm. What their physiology handles quietly, ours cannot handle at all. And this is where the myth becomes dangerous in a specific, delayed way. The human liver, exposed to amatoxin from a single death cap mushroom, begins shutting down within 48 hours. By the time the sweating starts and the hands begin trembling, the toxin is already deep inside the liver. But the mechanism is insidious because the early symptoms arrive, then temporarily ease. The victim usually believes they're recovering. That window of false improvement is the period during which permanent organ damage is already progressing. Then the liver starts shutting down. Then the kidneys follow. then the body's ability to clear toxins collapses entirely. Rescuers and medical teams see this pattern in foraging cases regularly. The hard calculus of survival nutrition is unambiguous. The human body can survive roughly 3 weeks without food. It cannot survive that kind of poisoning without hospital-level intervention. The universal edibility test, applied slowly, systematically, testing one part of one plant at a time, is the only cross-species food safety framework with any validity in an emergency, and even it has limitations with certain delayed action toxins. When in doubt, the math almost always favors hunger over the alternative. Most foraging deaths happen 2 days after a meal the person felt confident about. They never connected the decision to the outcome. By then, the window for straightforward medical intervention had already passed. Myth 5. Shelter means staying put and waiting for rescue. The myth isn't that shelter is unimportant. Staying put is genuinely the correct call in most wilderness emergencies. When your point last seen is logged, when search and rescue has been activated, when your shelter is functional and your thermal situation is stable. That protocol saves lives regularly. But the myth is the absolutism. The belief that staying put is always the right answer, regardless of conditions, has a specific and predictable failure mode. The slow onset environmental casualty. If your shelter is inadequate, if you're wet, if the temperature is dropping and your body cannot generate enough heat to maintain a survivable core temperature, then staying put doesn't preserve you. It just makes you easier to find afterward. Hypothermia compounds this problem because one of its symptoms is a paradoxical sensation of warmth. The thermoregulatory system misfiring in a way that removes your ability to accurately assess your own condition. Your instincts are telling you you're fine. Your instincts are lying. The decision framework for shelter versus movement has to run on 2 tracks simultaneously: current thermal status and trajectory. A person who is cold but stable in a functional shelter with reasonable expectation of search activation, that person stays. A person who is wet, in deteriorating shelter, in dropping temperatures with no realistic rescue window, that person must move toward warmth before cognitive function degrades past the point where effective navigation is possible. That decision must be made early, made while the mind is still clear. Rescuers see this consistently. The victims who had the longest survival windows were often the ones who waited too long to use them. Hypothermia rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives quietly, over hours, while the victim keeps following a rule that stopped applying long ago. By the time they understood, they no longer could. Every one of these myths shares the same structure, a fragment of real principle, distorted by oversimplification, repeated until it felt like fact, and stripped of the conditional logic that made the original insight useful in the first place. Real survival knowledge isn't a checklist. It's the ability to read what is actually happening, not what the training said should be happening, and respond accordingly. The night you need this, there's no time to reconsider, only time to execute. Because in survival, the wrong decision rarely feels wrong until it's irreversible.